15 years passed like sand through fingers. Jacob Miller was now 73 years old, and the years had not been kind. His back was bent from decades of labor, and his joints ached every morning when he woke. The ranch that had once been his refuge was now falling apart around him. The barn roof sagged dangerously. The fences were broken in a dozen places. The cattle were long gone, sold off one by one to pay for medicine and property taxes. He lived on a small pension from his years as a pilot and grew vegetables in a garden that got smaller each year. His hands shook when he tried to do detailed work, and sometimes he forgot things, simple things like whether he had eaten lunch or locked the front door. He knew he was declining, but there was nothing to be done about it. This was what getting old meant. The slow erosion of capability, the gradual narrowing of the world until it fit inside four walls and the space between bed and kitchen. Earth itself had changed in those 15 years. Most of humanity now lived on colony worlds scattered across dozens of star systems. The planet that had birthed their species was considered a backwater, a place for people too poor to leave or too stubborn to abandon the old ways. Corporate ships sometimes came to strip mine resources from the empty places, but they never stayed long. There was more profit to be made out among the stars. The few who remained on Earth were mostly indigenous peoples maintaining their ancestral lands, elderly folks who refused to die anywhere else, and hermits like Jacob who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. The government no longer cared about the rural areas. Services had dried up years ago. If you needed help, you helped yourself or you did without. Jacob had learned to do without. He rarely thought about Nina Blackfeather anymore. The memory of that winter storm and the small girl he had saved felt like something from another lifetime. Sometimes late at night, when sleep would not come, he would take out the beaded bracelet Chief Henry had given him and run his fingers over the smooth beads. But these moments were rare. Mostly he focused on getting through each day. There was wood to chop, food to prepare, repairs to attempt with tools that were older than most people. He went to town once every 2 months for supplies, and the people there treated him like a ghost. The old hermit from the hills, they called him. Some of the children were afraid of him. He did not mind. Fear was better than pity. What Jacob did not know, could not know, was that Nina had never forgotten him. She had grown from that frightened 8-year-old into a woman of remarkable strength and vision. She was now 23 years old and carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she stood for. 5 years ago, when her grandfather Chief Henry died, the tribal council had done something unprecedented. They had chosen Nina as the new chief, the youngest in the tribe's history. There had been opposition, of course. The elders argued she was too young, too idealistic, too willing to work with the outside world. But Nina had won them over with patience and respect. She listened to their concerns and honored their wisdom, while gently pushing for the changes she believed were necessary. She understood that her people's survival depended on adapting without losing themselves. Under Nina's leadership, the Apache nation began to thrive in ways no one had expected. She negotiated contracts with off-world corporations, but on her terms. They paid fair prices for resources and employed tribal members in good jobs. She used the money to build schools and medical centers. She brought in teachers who understood how to blend traditional knowledge with modern technology. The children learned their language and customs alongside mathematics and engineering. Nina also formed alliances with other indigenous nations across Earth: the Navajo, the Lakota, the Cree, and dozens of others. Together, they created a network of mutual support and shared resources. They proved that being forgotten by the galactic powers did not mean they had to be weak or dependent. But Nina had a secret, something she had been working on for years with only a handful of trusted advisors. She had watched the news from the colony worlds. She saw how humanity was spreading across the stars, how they were making friends and enemies among the alien species. She also saw the threats gathering on the horizon. There were whispers of a species called the Krell Dominion, aggressive and expansionist, conquering fringe colonies and demanding tribute. The Galactic Council did nothing. The major human governments talked and debated but took no action. Nina understood what this meant. When the Krell came, and she believed they would come eventually, Earth would be left to fend for itself. The colony worlds would be defended, but the homeworld would be written off as expendable. This was unacceptable to her, so Nina began building a fleet. It started small, with salvaged equipment and retired engineers who remembered how to build starships. She found a massive canyon system on tribal land and turned it into a hidden shipyard. Holographic projectors disguised the construction from satellites. The work went slowly at first. Money was scarce and skilled workers scarcer. But Nina was patient and persuasive. She brought together people from different tribes and different backgrounds, all united by a common cause. They scavenged parts from abandoned space stations. They traded with black market dealers for components that were technically illegal. They improvised and adapted and learned from their mistakes. After 10 years of secret work, they had built something real. A fleet of 30 ships, small by galactic standards but functional and armed. The problem was that Nina had ships, but she did not have experienced commanders. Most of her people had never been to space. Those who had were engineers or cargo haulers, not warriors. She needed someone who understood combat, who knew how to think tactically, who could train her inexperienced crews to fight against opponents with vastly superior technology. She spent months searching through records and making inquiries. Finally, she found a name that made her heart skip. Jacob Miller, former pilot for interplanetary freight, veteran of the Mars corporate wars before they were officially called wars, holder of 3 commendations for bravery under fire. He had retired to Earth 15 years ago after a family tragedy and had not been heard from since. Nina checked the address and felt a chill run down her spine. Jacob Miller lived on a failing ranch in northern Arizona, just a few miles from where he had saved her life. Nina did not believe in coincidence. She believed in patterns and connections, in the way lives touched each other and created ripples that spread across years. Jacob had saved her when she was helpless. Now she had the chance to give him something back, not just gratitude but purpose. She knew from the records that he was old and probably tired. She knew he might refuse, but she had to try. The memory of the quiet man who carried her through a blizzard had shaped who she became. The values he demonstrated without even trying, selflessness, courage, the simple act of helping because it was right. These had become the foundation of her leadership. If she could convince Jacob to help them, she believed they would have a chance. Without him, she feared her people would face the coming storm unprepared. The galactic situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Krell Dominion had begun its expansion in earnest. Colonies on the frontier were falling silent. Refugees fled toward the core systems with stories of overwhelming force and brutal occupation. The Galactic Council held emergency sessions but could not agree on a response. Each species wanted to protect its own interest first. Humanity's representative argued for a unified defense but was voted down. The human colonial governments began fortifying their most valuable worlds and quietly abandoning the rest. Earth was not even mentioned in the strategic plans. It was assumed to be irrelevant, too far from the Krell advance to matter, too poor in resources to be worth defending. This assumption would prove to be catastrophically wrong. Nina sat in her office late one evening, reviewing intelligence reports on her computer screen. The news was bad and getting worse. She pulled up a map showing the Krell advance. They were moving faster than anyone predicted, using some kind of new drive technology that let them jump between systems more quickly than conventional ships. If they maintained their current pace, they would reach the outer edges of human space within months. And after that, Nina calculated, they would reach Earth within a year, maybe less. She closed the computer and walked to the window. Outside, the night was clear and she could see stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere up there among those distant lights, an enemy was coming. Her people had survived colonization, had survived being pushed onto reservations, had survived attempts to erase their culture and identity. They would survive this too. But survival required preparation. It required leadership. And it required Jacob Miller. Nina made her decision. Tomorrow she would take a convoy to Jacob's ranch. She would face the man who saved her life and ask him to do it again. Not just for her, but for everyone on Earth who had been forgotten and written off. She did not know if he would say yes. She did not even know if he would remember her. But she had to try. The beaded bracelet her grandfather gave Jacob was meant as a token of gratitude. Now it would become a symbol of something larger. A connection between past and future, between one act of kindness and the survival. The wind howled across the frozen landscape like a wounded animal searching for shelter. Jacob Miller pulled his coat tighter around his thin frame and squinted against the blowing snow. The year was 2089 and the winters in northern Arizona had grown worse with each passing decade. Most people had left Earth by now. chasing dreams among the stars, but Jacob remained here in this forgotten corner of the world. He was 58 years old and looked older. His face was carved with deep lines from too much sun and too much sorrow. His hands were rough and scarred from years of ranch work. The cattle operation he ran was failing, had been failing for years, but he kept at it because he had nothing else. Once he had been someone different. Once he had piloted freight ships between the planets, had a wife who laughed at his jokes, had a daughter with bright eyes who called him Daddy. That was before the accident in space, before the explosion that took them both away and left him alone with memories that cut like broken glass. He came back to Earth after that, bought this ranch in the middle of nowhere and tried to forget. The forgetting never worked, but the isolation helped. Out here there was nobody to ask questions, nobody to offer sympathy he did not want, nobody to remind him of what he had lost. He was checking the fence line on the eastern edge of his property when he heard the howls. They were not the normal sounds of coyotes. These were deeper, hungrier, the calls of wolves. Jacob stopped walking and listened. The howls came again, closer now, and beneath them he heard something else, a child screaming. Without thinking, Jacob broke into a run. His boots crunched through the snow and his breath came in ragged gasps. He was not young anymore and his body protested the sudden effort. But he pushed through the pain. The screaming grew louder. He crested a small ridge and saw them below. A pack of 5 wolves circled a rocky outcrop where a small figure clung to the stones. It was a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing clothes that marked her as Apache. She must have wandered from the reservation lands that bordered his property. The wolves were gaunt and desperate, driven by hunger to attack even a human child. One of them lunged forward, snapping at her feet. The girl screamed again and tried to climb higher, but the rocks were slick with ice. Jacob unslung the rifle from his shoulder. He fired 3 shots into the air, the cracks echoing across the valley. The wolves scattered at the noise but did not run far. They paced at a distance, watching, waiting. Jacob knew they would come back as soon as he left. He had to get the girl out of there now. He half ran, half slid down the slope toward the outcrop. The girl stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. Her face was pale with cold and streaked with tears. Jacob reached up toward her and spoke in a calm voice. "Come on down," he said. "I will not hurt you." The girl hesitated. She looked at the wolves, then back at Jacob. Slowly, she began to climb down. Her hands were clumsy with cold and she slipped once, but Jacob caught her. He set her on the ground and immediately shrugged out of his coat, wrapping it around her small body. She was shivering violently. One of the wolves growled and took a step closer. Jacob fired another shot, this time deliberately close to the animal. The pack finally broke and ran, disappearing into the storm. The girl looked up at Jacob with dark eyes full of fear and confusion. "What is your name?" he asked. "Nina," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the wind. "Nina Blackfeather." Jacob nodded. "I am Jacob. We need to get you somewhere warm. Can you walk?" Nina tried to take a step, but her legs buckled. Jacob caught her again and realized she was not just cold. Her ankle was swollen, probably twisted in a fall. He looked around at the landscape. The storm was getting worse. Visibility was down to a few dozen feet. His ranch house was 3 miles away through increasingly deep snow. The girl would never make it on foot, and he was not sure he could carry her the whole way. But there was no choice. He could not leave her here. Jacob lifted Nina into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He started walking, following the fence line back toward home. The wind pushed against him like a physical force. Snow collected on his shoulders and in his hair. His arms began to ache after the first mile, but he did not stop. Nina buried her face against his chest. She had stopped shivering, which worried him. That was a sign of severe hypothermia. He talked to her as he walked, partly to keep her conscious and partly to keep himself focused. He told her about the ranch, about the 3 horses he kept, about the way the desert looked in spring when the cacti bloomed. Nina did not respond, but he felt her breathing, shallow and quick. The second mile was harder. His legs felt like lead and his lungs burned. Several times he stumbled and nearly fell. Each time he caught himself and kept going. The wind screamed around them. The world had become nothing but white and cold and the endless trudging forward. Jacob began to wonder if he had lost his way. Everything looked the same in the storm. But then he saw a dark shape ahead. The barn. He had made it. He staggered the last 100 yards to the house and kicked the door open. The warmth inside hit him like a wall. He carried Nina to the fireplace and laid her down on the old couch. Her lips were blue and her skin felt like ice. Jacob built up the fire until it roared, then stripped off Nina's wet clothes and wrapped her in every blanket he could find. He heated water on the stove and made her drink small sips. Slowly, over the course of an hour, color began to return to her face. Her shivering started again, which was a good sign. It meant her body was warming up and fighting back. That night, Jacob sat in a chair beside the couch and watched Nina sleep. Outside, the storm raged on. The power lines had gone down and the only light came from the fire. He thought about the girl's family. They must be frantic with worry, but there was no way to contact anyone. The communication systems were all dead. He would have to wait until the storm passed. For now, all he could do was make sure Nina stayed warm and safe. He found himself thinking about his own daughter, about the last time he had held her, about the way she used to fall asleep on the couch, just like this. The pain of the memory was sharp and immediate. He closed his eyes against it. When he opened them again, Nina was awake and watching him. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice was hoarse but steady. Jacob nodded. "You are safe now," he told her. "That is all that matters." The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, Jacob cared for Nina like she was his own. He treated her sprained ankle with ice and elevation. He fed her soup and bread. He told her stories to pass the time. Stories about flying between the planets, about seeing Saturn's rings up close, about the first time he landed on Mars. Nina listened with wide eyes, and sometimes she smiled. She told him about her family, about her grandfather who was the chief of their tribe, about learning to track animals and identify plants. She was smart and brave, this little girl, and Jacob found himself growing fond of her. On the 3rd day, the storm finally broke. The sky cleared to a brilliant blue and the sun came out. Jacob helped Nina to the window and they looked out at the transformed landscape. Everything was buried under 3 feet of snow. That afternoon, Jacob saw figures approaching across the snow. A group of people on horseback, moving slowly but steadily toward the ranch. Nina saw them too and her face lit up. "That is my grandfather," she said. Jacob carried her outside onto the porch. The riders came closer and he could see them more clearly now. There were perhaps a dozen of them, all Apache, all dressed for the harsh weather. The man in front was elderly but sat straight in his saddle. His face was weathered and stern. He dismounted and walked toward the porch. His eyes swept over Nina, checking her for injuries, then settled on Jacob. "Chief Henry Blackfeather," the old man said. His voice was formal, guarded. "Jacob Miller," Jacob replied. They stood in silence for a moment. The other riders watched from their horses. The tension was palpable. Jacob understood. These people had been betrayed too many times by outsiders. They had no reason to trust him. Nina spoke up from Jacob's arms. "Grandfather, this man saved my life. He carried me through the storm and took care of me. The wolves would have killed me." Chief Blackfeather's expression softened slightly. He looked at Jacob with new eyes, assessing him. "You have our gratitude," he said finally. The words were sincere but still careful. Jacob shook his head. "No gratitude needed. I just did what anyone would do." The chief's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Not anyone," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a beaded bracelet. The beadwork was intricate and beautiful, done in traditional patterns. He placed it in Jacob's hand. Nina ran to her grandfather, who lifted her onto his horse. Before they rode away, she turned and looked back at Jacob. "I will remember you," she called out. "I promise." Jacob stood on the porch and watched them disappear into the white landscape. He looked down at the bracelet in his hand. The beads caught the sunlight and gleamed. He slipped it into his pocket and went back inside. The house felt very empty suddenly. Outside, the sun shone on the snow and the world was beautiful and cold and silent. The autumn morning was cool and clear when Jacob heard the vehicles approaching. He was on the porch trying to repair a broken step when he saw the dust cloud rising from the dirt road. At first he thought it might be another corporate delegation coming to make an offer on his land. They showed up every few years with contracts and promises, trying to buy the property for nothing. Jacob always sent them away, but as the vehicles got closer, he realized these were not corporate transports. They were too sleek, too well-maintained, completely out of place in this desolate landscape. There were 5 of them moving in a tight formation like a military convoy. Jacob set down his hammer and stood up slowly. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that leaned against the porch rail. Old habits died hard. The vehicle stopped in front of his house and the doors opened in unison. Armed guards stepped out first, scanning the area with the practiced efficiency of professionals. Then a young woman emerged from the center vehicle. She was dressed in a striking blend of traditional Apache clothing and modern tactical gear. Her long, dark hair was pulled back in a braid, and she moved with the confidence of someone used to command. Jacob did not recognize her, but when she looked up at him and smiled, something in her eyes seemed familiar. She reached into a pocket and pulled out a beaded bracelet, holding it up so he could see. The pattern was identical to the one Jacob kept in a box beside his bed. His breath caught in his throat. Nina Blackfeather walked toward the porch and stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Hello, Jacob Miller," she said. Her voice was warm but formal. "Do you remember me?" Jacob stared at her. The frightened child he had carried through a blizzard was gone, replaced by this composed and clearly powerful woman. "I remember," he said finally. "You were just a little girl." Nina smiled more widely. "I was," she agreed. "And you saved my life. I told you I would remember. I have never forgotten." Jacob did not know what to say. The guards had fanned out around the vehicles, watching but not threatening. Whatever this was, it was important. "Why are you here?" he asked. Nina's smile faded. "I need your help," she said simply. "Can we talk inside?" Jacob led Nina into the house while the guards waited outside. The interior was sparse and worn but clean. Nina sat at the kitchen table and Jacob made coffee out of habit. When they both had cups in front of them, Nina began to speak. She told him about becoming chief, about the alliances she had built, about watching the galactic situation deteriorate. She explained how Earth had been abandoned by the colonial governments, how the indigenous nations were considered irrelevant by the powers that ruled humanity's expansion into space. Then she told him about the Krell Dominion and their aggressive expansion. She pulled out a small tablet and showed him maps, intelligence reports, projections. The Krell were coming and Earth was undefended. When they arrived, there would be no one to stop them. Jacob listened without interrupting. His coffee grew cold in his hands. When Nina finished, he set the cup down and looked at her. "What does this have to do with me?" he asked. Nina leaned forward. "We have built a fleet," she said. 30 ships armed and ready. We have engineers and volunteers from dozens of tribes. What we do not have is experienced leadership. We need someone who has fought in space, someone who understands tactics and can train our crews. We need you." Jacob felt something cold settle in his stomach. He shook his head slowly. "You have the wrong man," he said. "I am old and broken. I have not piloted a ship in 15 years. I want nothing to do with fighting or war. You need to find someone else." Nina did not argue. She simply watched him with those calm, dark eyes. "You think you are broken," she said quietly, "but I see a man who ran into danger to save a stranger's child. I see a man who carried me 3 miles through a blizzard when he could have left me to die. That man is not broken. He just forgot who he was." Jacob felt anger flare up inside him. "You do not know anything about me," he said harshly. "You do not know what I have lost or why I came here. I saved you because it was the right thing to do. That does not make me a hero. It does not mean I owe you anything now." Nina nodded. "You are right," she said. "You do not owe me anything, but I am not here to collect a debt. I am here to offer you something. A chance to matter again, a chance to protect people who cannot protect themselves. Is that not what you did for me?" Jacob stood up abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor. "I said no," he told her. "I am sorry you came all this way for nothing, but my answer is no." Nina stood as well. She did not look disappointed, just thoughtful. "Will you at least come see what we have built?" she asked. "Just a visit, no commitment. Let me show you the fleet and introduce you to our people. If you still want to refuse after that, I will accept your decision and never bother you again." Jacob wanted to say no immediately, but something stopped him. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the faint echo of who he used to be. Maybe it was just loneliness and the prospect of seeing something new. "Fine," he said. "One visit. But that is all." They left within the hour. Jacob locked up the house and climbed into one of the vehicles with Nina. The guards treated him with wary respect. As they drove away from the ranch, Jacob looked back at the dilapidated buildings and wondered if he would return. The thought did not bother him as much as it should have. The convoy headed south and east, deeper into reservation lands. The landscape was rugged and beautiful in a harsh way. Red rock formations rose against the blue sky. Scattered juniper trees clung to life in the thin soil. Nina pointed out landmarks as they drove and told him about the land's history. She spoke with pride and love for this place. Jacob found himself listening more closely than he intended. After 2 hours, they reached a canyon system that Jacob had seen on maps but never visited. The canyons were deep and narrow, carved by ancient rivers that had long since dried up. Nina's convoy descended on a winding road that hugged the canyon wall. At the bottom, the air was cooler and shadows stretched long across the rocky floor. Nina gestured for the vehicles to stop. "We walk from here," she said. Jacob climbed out stiffly and followed Nina along a narrow path. The guards stayed behind. They rounded a bend in the canyon and Jacob stopped dead in his tracks. What he saw should not have been possible. The canyon opened into a vast natural amphitheater, but instead of empty rock, it was filled with starships. Dozens of them lined up in neat rows or suspended from scaffolding attached to the canyon walls. They were unlike anything Jacob had seen before. Angular and sleek, built from what looked like a patchwork of different technologies. Some had tribal markings painted on their hulls. Others bore names in various indigenous languages. The scale of it was staggering. This was not a hobby project or a symbolic gesture. This was a real fleet built in secret over years of painstaking work. Jacob felt his legs go weak. "How?" he whispered. Nina stood beside him with her arms crossed, looking out at her creation. "We scavenged, we traded, we improvised," she said. "We found people who still believed Earth was worth defending, and we gave them purpose. It took 10 years and more resources than we should have had, but we did it." Jacob walked forward slowly, his engineer's eye taking in details. The ships were functional but not standardized. Each one showed signs of different construction methods and design philosophies. Some components were clearly human-made, salvaged from old military stock. Others looked alien, probably traded or stolen from off-world sources. It was a miracle they flew at all, but Jacob could see that they did. Scorch marks on some hulls indicated recent flight tests. "This is insane," he said, but there was admiration in his voice. Nina smiled. "Probably," she agreed, "but it is also necessary. Come meet the crews." She led him to a central building that had been carved into the canyon wall. Inside, dozens of people worked at computer terminals and equipment stations. They were young mostly, in their 20s and 30s, wearing a mix of traditional clothing and technical gear. When Nina entered, they looked up and several called out greetings. Nina introduced Jacob to Daniel Redsky, her second in command. Daniel was Lakota, tall and broad-shouldered with calloused hands and sharp eyes. He looked Jacob up and down critically. "So you are the famous pilot," Daniel said. His tone was skeptical. "Nina says you can help us." Jacob met his gaze. "I have not agreed to anything," he replied. Daniel grunted. "Good," he said, "because we do not need tourists. If you are here, you work. If you cannot work, you leave." Jacob felt a flicker of irritation, but also a grudging respect. This man was protecting his people. That was something Jacob understood. "Fair enough," he said. Over the next several hours, Nina showed Jacob everything. The ships, the weapon systems, the training simulations they had been running. She introduced him to Lieutenant Helen Winters, a former colonial officer who had defected when her government ordered her to abandon Earth. Helen was disciplined and professional, clearly hungry for guidance. She immediately recognized Jacob's background and peppered him with questions about fleet tactics. Jacob answered automatically, his old knowledge coming back. As the afternoon wore on, something began to shift inside him. He saw the hope in these people's eyes. They were scared but determined, untrained but willing to learn. They reminded him of the crew on his first freight run decades ago, back when he still believed he could make a difference. The trap was set with precision that came from desperation and experience. Jacob broadcast a fake distress signal on Krell frequencies, making it appear that several sovereign skyships had been crippled and were falling back toward Earth for emergency repairs. The transmission included just enough technical detail to be convincing. Damaged power cores, failing life support, wounded crew. It was exactly the kind of opportunity an overconfident enemy would pursue. Thrackan took the bait. He ordered 6 of his warships to pursue the retreating vessels and finish them off. The Krell ships accelerated toward Earth, eager to score an easy victory and restore their wounded pride. They entered the upper atmosphere in a tight formation, their sensors locked on the fleeing human ships below them. The moment the Krell ships committed to the atmospheric entry, everything changed. Hidden defensive platforms on the surface came online. Ancient military satellites that everyone had assumed were dead suddenly activated. Surface-based railgun emplacements opened fire. The sky above Earth erupted with weapons fire. Missiles streaked upward on pillars of flame. Railgun rounds tore through the atmosphere with sonic booms that rattled windows hundreds of miles away. The Krell ships, designed for combat in the void of space, struggled to maneuver in the denser atmosphere. Their shields deflected some of the incoming fire, but not all of it. 2 ships were hit critically and began to fall, breaking apart as they descended. One crashed into the Pacific Ocean with an impact that created a tsunami. The other came down in the Australian outback, leaving a crater 3 miles wide. The supposedly crippled Sovereign skyships suddenly revealed themselves to be perfectly functional. They emerged from low orbit and attacked the remaining Krell vessels from below. The battle became a chaotic melee with ships weaving through fire and atmospheric turbulence. Jacob coordinated the attack from his command ship, which he had named the Wanderer after his years of aimless drifting before Nina found him again. His voice was calm over the communication channels even as explosions lit up the sky around him. "Focus fire on their propulsion systems," he ordered. "Make them fall." The Sovereign Sky pilots responded with precision. They had trained for this exact scenario. Ship after ship targeted the Krell vessel's engines and maneuvering thrusters. One by one, the alien warships lost control and began their death spirals toward the surface. But the victory came at a cost. 3 more Sovereign skyships were destroyed. One took a direct hit from a Krell plasma cannon and simply vanished in a ball of superheated gas. Another collided with debris from a destroyed enemy vessel and broke apart. The third sacrificed itself deliberately, ramming a Krell ship that was about to fire on a damaged friendly vessel. Jacob watched the tactical display as the icons representing his ships winked out one by one. Each one represented dozens of lives, people he had trained and worked with, brave souls who had trusted him to lead them. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Thraken watched from his flagship in high orbit, rage and disbelief warring on his features. He had lost half his fleet to what was supposed to be a primitive and undefended world. The humans had tricked him, humiliated him, destroyed ships that represented decades of Krell military tradition. It was unacceptable. If he could not win tactically, he would win through overwhelming force. Thraken ordered his remaining capital ships to pull back beyond the atmosphere and bombard Earth from orbit. He would glass the planet if necessary. The honor of the Krell Dominion demanded it. His weapons officers began charging the main cannons. In 10 minutes, they would rain destruction on every major population center. Earth would burn. On the Wanderer, Jacob saw what was happening. His tactical computer calculated the firing vectors and showed him the projected damage. Billions would die. Everything they had fought for would be meaningless. He looked at the display showing the Krell flagship positioning itself for bombardment. There was only one way to stop it. Someone had to take out that ship, and they had to do it in the next few minutes. Jacob turned to Nina, who stood beside him on the bridge. Her face was pale but composed. "We cannot reach them in time with the fleet," Jacob said quietly. "But one ship, moving fast and light, might get through their defensive screen." Nina understood immediately. "No," she said. Her voice broke. "Jacob, no. There has to be another way." Jacob shook his head. "There is not," he said gently. "You know that. Someone has to do this, and I am the best pilot we have. The Wanderer is fast, and I know how to fly her. I can make it." Nina grabbed his arm. "You saved my life," she said desperately. "I will not let you throw yours away." Jacob smiled. "I am not throwing it away," he told her. "I am spending it on something that matters. 15 years ago, I was a dead man walking. I had lost everything and was just waiting to die. Then you came and gave me a reason to live. Now I am giving you and everyone else on this planet a chance to keep living. That is a fair trade." He pulled her into a brief, tight hug. "Lead them well, Chief Blackfeather," he whispered. "Make sure they remember this day." Then he pushed her gently toward Helen. "Get her off my ship," he ordered. Helen nodded, tears streaming down her face. She took Nina's arm and began pulling her toward the docking airlock. Nina fought, but Helen was stronger. As they reached the airlock, Nina screamed Jacob's name. He did not look back. Jacob sealed the bridge and took manual control of the Wanderer. The ship was battered and barely holding together after the intense fighting. Half the system showed red warning lights. The hull had dozens of breaches that emergency sealant was struggling to contain. But the engine still worked and the weapons still fired. That was all he needed. Jacob programmed a course directly toward the Krell flagship and engaged full thrust. The acceleration pressed him back into his seat. The Wanderer shot forward like an arrow released from a bow. The Krell spotted him almost immediately. Defense turrets swiveled to track his approach. Energy beams lanced through space. Jacob threw the Wanderer into a series of evasive maneuvers that would have torn apart a less sturdy ship. He flew with decades of skill and a recklessness born from knowing he would not survive. The Wanderer took hit after hit. Hull plating peeled away. Internal systems failed. The ship was dying around him, but it kept flying. Jacob laughed out loud, a sound of pure defiant joy. He was alive in this moment, more alive than he had been in 15 years. This was who he was meant to be. He opened a communication channel, broadcasting on all frequencies so that everyone would hear. "This is Commander Jacob Miller of the Sovereign Sky," he said. His voice was steady and strong. "To Nina and all the people of Earth, I want you to know something. We have already won. Not because we defeated the Krell, but because we refused to be erased. They came here thinking we were weak and forgotten. We showed them they were wrong. Remember this day. Remember that resistance is not about victory. It is about refusing to surrender who you are. It is about standing up even when the odds are impossible. It is about fighting for something bigger than yourself. You did that today. Be proud, be strong, and never ever let them forget you exist." The Wanderer was close now, less than a mile from the Krell flagship. Thraken saw the human ship coming and understood what was about to happen. He ordered evasive action, but it was too late. The massive warship could not maneuver quickly enough. Jacob aimed for the flagship's main reactor core. Every ship had a weak point, and he had identified this one during the earlier battles. He pushed the engines past their safety limits. Alarms screamed throughout the ship. The hull began to glow from the friction and stress. Jacob thought about his wife and daughter, gone so many years ago. He thought about Nina and the frightened little girl he had saved from wolves. He thought about all the brave people he had led into battle. Then he stopped thinking entirely and just flew. The Wanderer struck the Krell flagship at nearly a quarter of light speed. The impact was catastrophic. Jacob's ship penetrated deep into the enemy vessel's hull before the collision triggered both reactors simultaneously. The resulting explosion was visible from the surface of Earth as a second sun that burned for 3 full seconds. The Krell flagship broke apart, massive sections tumbling away in all directions. Warlord Thraken died instantly, along with his entire command crew. The explosion also took out 2 nearby Krell escort ships that had been too close to the flagship. In one terrible, beautiful moment, Jacob Miller had destroyed the heart of the invasion force. On the evacuation shuttle, Nina watched through the viewport as the explosion blossomed across the sky. She made no sound, but tears poured down her face. Around her, the other survivors were silent. Helen placed a hand on Nina's shoulder but said nothing. There were no words. Back on Earth, billions of people watched the same explosion on their screens. They did not know the name of the pilot who had just saved them. But they would learn. Nina would make sure of that. The remaining Krell ships, leaderless and demoralized, began to retreat. The battle was over. Earth had survived, but the cost had been terrible. Nina clutched the beaded bracelet that had been recovered from the Wanderer's last transmission beacon. Jacob had programmed it to eject before impact. Even in his final moments, he had thought about preserving something for those left behind. She held the bracelet tight and whispered a prayer in her. The wreckage of the Krell flagship hung in orbit like a monument to human defiance. Pieces of the massive warship drifted slowly through space, some still glowing from the heat of the explosion. The surviving Krell vessels had jumped to hyperspace within minutes of their commander's death, retreating to regroup and report their shocking defeat. Earth's defenders had won, but the victory felt hollow. Nearly half the Sovereign Sky Fleet was destroyed. 347 people were dead. Among them was Jacob Miller, the old rancher who had become a legend in the span of 3 months. Nina stood in the command center surrounded by her surviving officers. The room should have been filled with celebration, but instead there was only exhausted silence. People stared at their screens or sat slumped in their chairs. They had done the impossible, but the price had broken something inside all of them. Daniel Redsky was the first to speak. "We need to start recovery operations," he said quietly. "There are still people trapped in damaged ships. Some might be alive." Nina nodded mechanically. "Make it happen," she said. "Helen, coordinate with surface rescue teams. Daniel, get your engineers working on salvage. We need to know what we can repair and what is beyond saving." The officers moved to carry out their orders, grateful to have something to focus on besides their grief. Nina remained standing at the central console, staring at the tactical display. The icon representing the Wanderer was gone, replaced by a debris field marker. She reached up and touched the screen where Jacob's ship had been. "Thank you," she whispered. News of the battle spread across Earth within hours. Every communication network on the planet carried the story. An indigenous fleet had defended the homeworld against an alien invasion. A forgotten rancher had sacrificed himself to save billions. The major human governments who had abandoned Earth to its fate suddenly found themselves embarrassed and scrambling to respond. Politicians gave speeches praising Earth's courage. Military officials claimed they had always known the planet was defensible. Corporate media ran endless analysis of the battle tactics. But the people of Earth knew the truth. They had been saved by those their own species had cast aside. The indigenous nations, the poor, the stubborn few who refused to leave. These forgotten people had stood between humanity and annihilation. The Galactic Council was forced to take notice. News of Earth's defense reached the core worlds and spread to every species in the known galaxy. The Krell Dominion, which had seemed unstoppable, had been bloodied by a planet everyone considered primitive. Other threatened worlds began asking questions. If Earth could resist, why could they not? Representatives from dozens of species requested details about the battle tactics used. The human governments, sensing an opportunity, offered to share their military expertise. Nina received their messages with cold contempt. "Where were you when we needed help?" she responded to one particularly condescending offer. "We will share what we learned, but not with you. We will share with those who faced the same threat we did." In the weeks following the battle, Nina worked tirelessly to rebuild the Sovereign Sky Fleet. Ships were repaired. New recruits volunteered to replace the fallen. But Nina also did something unexpected. She reached out to other marginalized groups across the galaxy, refugee colonies that had been abandoned, indigenous populations on other worlds, mining communities on distant asteroids who had been exploited and forgotten. She offered to share everything the Sovereign Sky had learned about asymmetric warfare and self-defense. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of groups requested training and assistance. Nina could not help them all, but she helped as many as she could. The Indigenous Defense Network, as it came to be called, grew rapidly. It was not a formal military alliance, but rather a loose collection of peoples who had decided they would no longer rely on governments that did not care about them. 6 months after the battle, the Galactic Council formally recognized the Earth Coalition and granted it a seat. Nina traveled to the council chambers, a massive space station orbiting a neutral world. She wore traditional Apache clothing, modified with modern materials. She carried no weapons, but her bearing made it clear she needed none. When she spoke before the assembled representatives of 100 species, her words were measured and powerful. "You forgot about Earth," she said. "You forgot about the people who could not afford to leave their homeworld. When danger came, you wrote us off. You assumed we would fall without a fight. We proved you wrong. But we are not here for your apologies. We are here to make sure you never forget us again." The chamber was silent. Some representatives looked ashamed. Others looked angry. But all of them listened. Nina demanded and received recognition of indigenous sovereignty on Earth and other worlds. She secured funding for defense systems and economic development. Most importantly, she established a precedent. The forgotten peoples of the galaxy had a voice now. They had power. And they would use both to protect themselves and each other. The Krell Dominion's expansion slowed as they faced resistance on multiple fronts. The Battle of Earth had inspired others to fight back. The galactic balance of power shifted. Humanity, and particularly Earth's indigenous nations, emerged as key players in the new order. But political victories meant little to Nina compared to what she had lost. She thought about Jacob constantly. Late at night, alone in her quarters, she would hold the beaded bracelet and remember. 1 year after the battle, Nina returned to Arizona. She traveled to Jacob's abandoned ranch, which had sat empty since he left to join her cause. The buildings were falling apart, slowly being reclaimed by the desert. Nina walked through the rooms where Jacob had lived his solitary life. She found old photographs in a drawer. Jacob as a young man in a pilot's uniform. Jacob with a beautiful woman who must have been his wife. Jacob holding a small girl who had her mother's smile. Nina understood then why he had been so broken when she found him. Why he had isolated himself. why saving her had mattered so much. She was the same age his daughter would have been. Nina contacted the tribal council and requested permission to build something on the ranch land. They agreed immediately. Over the next 6 months, a monument was constructed on the spot where Jacob had lived. It was simple but powerful. A statue of a man holding a child's hand, standing against a storm. The figures were carved from local stone by indigenous artists. Around the base, names were inscribed. Jacob Miller and the 346 others who died defending Earth. An inscription read, "They stood when no one else would." They fought when victory seemed impossible. They gave everything so that we might live. Remember them. Honor them. Be worthy of their sacrifice. The monument became a pilgrimage site. People traveled from across Earth and eventually from across the galaxy to see it. Veterans of other battles came to pay their respects. Children learned about the Battle of Earth in their schools and asked to visit the place where the hero had lived. Nina returned every year on the anniversary of Jacob's death. She would stand before the monument for hours, sometimes alone, sometimes with thousands of others. She would tell stories about the man she knew. Not the legend, but the person. The quiet rancher who saved a lost child. The reluctant warrior who agreed to help because it was right. The leader who never asked anyone to take a risk he would not take himself. The sovereign sky fleet grew to over 100 ships. It became a professional military force while maintaining its roots in indigenous culture. Every new recruit learned about Jacob Miller. His tactics were studied and refined. His principles, selflessness, courage, and the obligation to protect those who could not protect themselves, became the foundation of the fleet's code. When new officers received their commissions, they swore an oath that ended with the words, "I will remember Jacob Miller. I will honor his sacrifice. I will never surrender." Nina oversaw all of this while continuing to lead the Apache Nation. She married Daniel Redsky, and together they built a life that balanced tradition with progress. They had children who grew up knowing they came from a people who had resisted, survived, and thrived. But no matter how busy her life became, Nina always carried the beaded bracelet. She wore it on her wrist during council meetings and diplomatic negotiations. She touched it when she needed strength. It was her connection to the past and her reminder of what really mattered. The Krell Dominion eventually sued for peace. Their expansion had been stopped by the resistance they encountered. The galaxy settled into a new equilibrium. Earth was no longer forgotten or ignored. The indigenous nations were respected as equals, and the story of one old rancher who saved a child and then saved a world became known across 1,000 planets. Nina understood that victory was not measured in battles won or enemies defeated. Victory was measured in survival, in maintaining identity and dignity in the face of those who would take both away. Jacob had taught her that, first by saving her life and then by showing her how to fight for something bigger than herself. 20 years after the battle, Nina stood once more at the monument. She was older now, her hair showing streaks of gray. Her children stood beside her along with Daniel and Helen and Kai and so many others who had survived and carried on. The sun was setting behind the red rocks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jacob found Nina in the command center the next morning. She was reviewing supply manifests with Daniel when he walked in. The room fell quiet as people noticed him. Nina looked up and Jacob saw the question in her eyes. "I will help you," he said simply. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Jacob held up a hand. "But understand this," he continued. "I cannot promise miracles and I cannot guarantee victory. What I can do is give you a fighting chance. That means hard work, long hours, and brutal honesty about where you are and what you need to improve. Some of you will not like me. Some of you will think my methods are too harsh. But if you want to survive what is coming, you will listen and you will learn." The cheering died down. The crew members exchanged glances. Nina stepped forward and offered her hand. "Welcome to the Sovereign Sky Fleet, Commander Miller," she said formally. Jacob shook her hand. "Just call me Commander," he said. "Rank means nothing if we do not survive." The first week was devoted to assessment. Jacob inspected every ship personally, crawling through maintenance corridors and examining systems with an engineer's critical eye. What he found was both impressive and terrifying. The ships were functional but inconsistent. Each vessel had been built or modified by different tribal engineers, leading to a bewildering variety of systems and configurations. One ship might use human standard power distribution, while the next used an improvised fusion reactor built from scavenged alien technology. Communication protocols varied from ship to ship. Weapon systems ranged from military-grade railguns to jury-rigged energy cannons that looked like they might explode if fired at full power. It was a logistics nightmare. But Jacob also saw ingenuity and resourcefulness. These people had built a fleet from nothing. They just needed structure and standardization. Jacob called a meeting of all senior personnel. He stood in front of a large display screen showing technical diagrams and spoke bluntly. "This fleet is a mess," he said. "You have 30 ships, but right now they cannot work together effectively. We need to standardize communications, navigation protocols, and combat procedures. That means retrofitting and reorganizing. It will take time we do not have, but it has to be done." Daniel crossed his arms. "How long?" he asked. Jacob considered. 2 months minimum, he said. "Maybe 3 if we run into complications." "We do not have 3 months, Daniel replied. "The Krell could be here in 6. Jacob met his gaze. "Then we work faster," he said. "I need your best engineers working around the clock. Helen, you coordinate the combat system upgrades. Daniel, you handle power and propulsion standardization. Nina, you keep everything else running so we can focus on this." Everyone nodded except Daniel, who looked skeptical but said nothing. The work began immediately. Jacob established a command structure based on his military experience. Each ship was assigned a captain and officers. Crews were organized into watches. Training schedules were posted and enforced. He started running simulations, basic at first, just getting crews used to working together. The first few runs were disasters. Ships collided during formation exercises. Communication channels crossed and created confusion. Weapons targeting systems failed to lock properly. Jacob watched it all with a grim expression and took notes. After each simulation, he gathered the crews and conducted detailed debriefings. He pointed out every mistake without sugarcoating anything. Some people took it well. Others bristled at his criticism. A young Navajo pilot named Kai Begay was particularly vocal. "This is not our way," Kai said during one heated exchange. "We believe in consensus and discussion. You just give orders and expect us to follow blindly." Jacob looked at him steadily. "In battle there is no time for consensus," he said. "Hesitation kills. I will listen to your ideas during planning and I will respect your input. But once the fighting starts, orders must be followed immediately. That is not negotiable." The tension between Jacob's military discipline and the crew's cultural values created friction. Nina had to mediate several disputes. She called a general assembly in the Canyon Amphitheater and addressed everyone. "We are fighting for the right to exist on our own terms," she said. "That means respecting both our traditions and the realities we face. Commander Miller is not here to change who we are. He is here to teach us how to survive. Our ancestors adapted when they needed to while keeping their identity intact. We must do the same." The crew listened and gradually the grumbling decreased. People began to understand that Jacob was not their enemy. He was just the voice of a harsh truth they needed to hear. As weeks passed, the fleet began to take shape. Ships were retrofitted with standardized components. Communication protocols were harmonized. Jacob created a tactical doctrine based on the fleet's strengths and weaknesses. They could not match the Krell in firepower or technology, so they would use speed and maneuverability. They would fight like guerrillas in space, striking hard and disappearing before the enemy could retaliate. He trained them in hit-and-run tactics, teaching them to use terrain like asteroid fields and debris zones to their advantage. Helen proved invaluable during this process. She had actual combat experience and understood modern warfare. Together, she and Jacob developed a series of standard engagement protocols that crews could execute without constant communication. This would be crucial if communications were jammed during battle. Daniel remained skeptical, but his respect for Jacob grew as he saw the improvements. The engineer threw himself into solving technical problems, often working 20-hour days. He created a modular system for emergency repairs that could be implemented quickly during combat. He also improved the power distribution systems, squeezing more efficiency from the aging reactors. Late one night, Jacob found Daniel still working in a maintenance bay. "You should get some rest," Jacob told him. Daniel looked up from the engine component he was calibrating. "So should you," he replied. They worked side by side in silence for a while. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I thought you were just some old glory seeker when you arrived," he said. "Someone who wanted to feel important again." Jacob smiled slightly. "Maybe I was," he admitted. "But this is bigger than me. You have all built something remarkable here. I am just trying to make sure it survives long enough to matter. Daniel nodded slowly. We are going to die, are we not? He said quietly. Probably, Jacob replied honestly. But we are going to make them pay for it. That is all any warrior can ask for. After 6 weeks of intensive training, Jacob decided to run a comprehensive live fire exercise. The entire fleet would deploy to a remote sector, littered with derelict satellites and space debris. Their mission was to navigate through the obstacles while engaging simulated enemy drones. It would test everything they had learned. The day of the exercise arrived. Jacob watched from the command ship as 30 vessels lifted off from the canyon in perfect formation. They climbed through Earth's atmosphere and accelerated toward the designated sector. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. Ships maintained proper spacing. Communication was crisp and professional. Weapons crews tracked targets with improving accuracy. Jacob allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. Then one of the ships, a frigate called Desert Wind, reported a power failure. The vessel went dark and began drifting toward a dense debris field. Jacob immediately ordered a rescue operation. Helen and Kai worked together to coordinate the response. 2 ships moved in to stabilize Desert Wind while engineers tried to restore power remotely. It took 30 minutes of tense maneuvering before they got the ship under control and towed it to safety. The exercise was a failure. Back in the canyon that evening, Jacob assembled the entire crew. His face was grim. We are not ready, he said bluntly. The silence was heavy. Today we learned important lessons, Jacob continued. The Krell will not give us 30 minutes to fix a power failure. They will not wait while we figure out a rescue operation. Every mistake costs lives. Right now, we make too many mistakes. The crew looked demoralized. Some people stared at the ground. Others exchanged worried glances. Nina stood up from where she had been sitting. She walked to the front of the assembly and stood beside Jacob. Everything Commander Miller said is true, she declared. We are not ready. But consider what we have already accomplished. 3 months ago, we were scattered individuals with no experience working together. Now we are a fleet. We made mistakes today, but we also showed we can respond to emergencies. We can adapt. We can learn. The Krell have superior technology and experience, but they do not have what we have. She paused and looked around at her people. They do not have a home worth dying for. They do not have ancestors watching over them. They do not have the determination that comes from being told you do not matter. We may not be ready yet, but we will be. And when the Krell come, they will learn that Earth's forgotten people are not so easy to erase. The crew erupted in shouts of agreement. Jacob watched Nina and felt a swell of pride. This was why she was their chief. She knew how to inspire hope even in dark moments. Later that night, Jacob sat alone in his quarters reviewing the exercise data. There was so much work still to do. But for the first time since he arrived, he believed they might actually have a chance. It would not be easy. Many of these brave young people would probably die, but they would not go quietly. 30 years had passed since the Battle of Earth. The galaxy had changed in ways no one could have predicted when Nina first asked Jacob for help. Earth was now a thriving world again, its population growing as people returned from the colonies to reconnect with humanity's birthplace. The indigenous nations had become prosperous and influential, maintaining their cultural identities while embracing technologies that improved their lives without compromising their values. The sovereign sky fleet had evolved into a respected military force, one that other worlds called upon when they needed help defending against aggression or piracy. But more than that, it had become a symbol, a reminder that the forgotten and dismissed could rise up and change history. Nina Blackfeather was 61 years old now. Her hair was white and her face lined with the marks of a life fully lived. She had led her people through 3 decades of peace and prosperity. She had raised 4 children, all of whom now held important positions in the Earth Coalition. Her eldest daughter commanded a sovereign sky cruiser. Her son was an engineer who designed next-generation defense systems. The other 2 worked in diplomacy, building bridges between Earth and the countless worlds that had joined the indigenous defense network. Nina had achieved more than she ever imagined possible when she was a frightened child lost in a blizzard. But she never forgot where it all began. Every year on the anniversary of the battle, Nina made the pilgrimage to Jacob's monument. It had become a tradition that thousands followed. The site had grown into a memorial complex that included a museum, an archive of oral histories from the battle survivors, and a training center where young officers learned the principles Jacob had taught. The monument itself remained unchanged, the simple statue of a man and child standing against the storm. But around it, the desert had been transformed into a garden. Trees that should not have been able to grow in this harsh climate flourished here, nurtured by an irrigation system that used captured rainwater. It was a living reminder that care and determination could bring life to the most unlikely places. This year's anniversary ceremony was particularly significant. It marked 3 decades since the battle. Dignitaries came from across the galaxy. The human colonial government sent representatives, though they were no longer the dominant power they once were. Alien species who had been inspired by Earth's defense sent delegations. Most importantly, thousands of ordinary people came. Veterans of various conflicts, families who had lost loved ones, young people who knew the story only from history books but wanted to pay their respects. Nina stood at the front of the gathered crowd. Beside her were Daniel, now 70, and, walking with a cane but still sharp as ever, and Helen, who had retired from active service but still taught tactics at the academy. Kai, the young pilot who had once challenged Jacob's methods, was now an admiral in the Sovereign Sky Fleet. He stood with the other senior officers, their uniforms bearing medals and honors earned over decades of service. Nina stepped forward to speak. Her voice was still strong, carrying across the assembled thousands. She did not use amplification, preferring to project naturally, as her grandfather had taught her. 30 years ago today, she began, Earth stood alone against an enemy that should have destroyed us. We had no allies. The powers that ruled human space had written us off as expendable. But we had something they did not understand. We had people who refused to be erased. She paused and gestured to the monument. This man, Jacob Miller, represented everything that made our victory possible. He was not extraordinary when Nina first met him. He was broken, isolated, living in the ruins of a life that tragedy had destroyed. But when a child needed help, he ran toward danger without hesitation. That one act of selfless courage planted a seed that would grow into salvation for billions, Nina continued, her eyes scanning the crowd. Jacob taught us that heroism is not about being special or gifted. It is about choosing to act when action is needed. He taught us that one person who cares can change everything. He taught us that the powerful do not get to decide who matters. We decide that ourselves through our actions and our refusal to surrender. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. These were lessons people across the galaxy had learned from Earth's example. Resistance movements on a dozen worlds had succeeded using the tactics Jacob pioneered. Indigenous groups everywhere had gained recognition and rights by following the path Nina blazed. The Forgotten Rancher's legacy extended far beyond Earth's orbit. After the ceremony, Nina walked alone to the monument. She reached up and placed her hand on the stone, feeling the warmth absorbed from the desert sun. I wish you could see what you started, she said softly. We are not just surviving, we are thriving, and we have not forgotten the lessons you taught us. She felt a presence beside her and looked to see a young woman in a Sovereign Sky uniform. The woman saluted crisply. Chief Blackfeather, she said. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Claire Whitehorse. I am a new officer in the fleet. Nina smiled warmly. Welcome, Claire. Where are you from? The young woman stood at attention. I am Navajo, from the Northern Territories. I grew up hearing stories about you and Commander Miller. Those stories are why I joined the fleet. I want to serve something bigger than myself. Nina studied the young officer's face and saw the same determination she had felt 30 years ago. You remind me of who I was at your age, she said. Eager, idealistic, ready to change the world. Claire smiled shyly. Did you succeed? She asked. In changing the world, I mean. Nina considered the question seriously. We changed some things, she said. We proved that the forgotten matter. We showed that courage and determination can overcome superior force. We built something lasting, but there is always more work to do. Injustice and oppression do not end. They just take new forms. Every generation must choose to stand up and fight for what is right. She placed a hand on Claire's shoulder. Now it is your turn. Learn from what we did, but do not just copy us. Find your own way. Face your own challenges. Build your own legacy. Claire nodded seriously. I will, Chief. I promise. Nina watched the young woman walk away and felt a deep sense of peace. This was the true measure of their victory. Not the battle they won, but the future they secured. A future where young people like Claire could grow up free and strong, ready to face whatever challenges came next. That evening, as the sun set, behind the red rocks, Nina sat alone on the porch of the small house she and Daniel had built near the monument. The desert was beautiful in the fading light. She pulled out the beaded bracelet worn smooth now from decades of handling. She thought about the chain of events that had led from a winter storm to a galactic upheaval. How one act of kindness had cascaded through time and space, touching millions of lives. She thought about Jacob, the broken man who found redemption in service. She wondered if he had known in those final seconds before impact how much he mattered. She hoped he had. She wanted him to have died with the knowledge that his life meant something. Nina heard footsteps and turned to see Daniel approaching with 2 cups of tea. He sat beside her with a contented sigh. Hell of a ceremony, he said. You spoke well. Nina took the tea gratefully. I was just thinking about Jacob, she said. About whether he knew how important he was. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He knew, he said finally. I talked to him the night before he died. He told me he had spent 15 years being dead inside. Then you gave him a chance to live again, even if only for a few months. He said those months were worth more than all the empty years that came before. He knew exactly what he was doing when he made that final run, and he was at peace with it. Nina felt tears slide down her cheeks. Thank you for telling me, she whispered. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Up there among those distant lights, the galaxy continued its complex dance of politics and power. But here on Earth, in this quiet place, 2 old warriors rested. They had fought their battles. They had paid their costs. Now they could simply be. Daniel eventually dozed off, his head tilted back against the chair. Nina remained awake, sipping her tea and thinking about legacy. Not the grand historical legacy that historians would study, but the personal legacy that lived in the hearts of those who remembered. Jacob's legacy was not just the battle he won, it was the values he embodied and passed on. Selflessness, courage, the simple determination to help when help was needed. Those values had spread like ripples in a pond, touching lives that Jacob would never know about. Nina thought about the countless children across the galaxy who learned Jacob's story in school. The young people who joined defense forces inspired by his example. The leaders who made difficult choices guided by his principles. The parents who taught their kids that one person can make a difference. All of this had started with an old rancher running through a blizzard to save a child from wolves. She smiled at the beautiful simplicity of it. The most profound changes often began with the smallest acts. A hand extended in friendship, a moment of courage. A choice to care when caring was difficult. These were the seeds from which forest grew. As full darkness fell, Nina looked up at the stars one last time. Somewhere out there, people were fighting their own battles. The alarm woke Jacob at 4 a.m. He was out of bed and moving before his mind fully registered what was happening. The emergency klaxon echoed through the compound, harsh and insistent. People were running in the corridors outside his quarters. Jacob pulled on his clothes and rushed to the command center. Nina was already there, still in her sleeping clothes, staring at a display screen. Her face was pale. Daniel stood beside her, looking equally shocked. What is it? Jacob asked. Nina turned to him. The Krell, she said. They hit the outer colonies 2 days ago. Everything past the Centauri systems is gone. Jacob felt his stomach drop. That is 3 months ahead of our projections, he said. Nina nodded. They have some kind of new drive technology. They can move faster than we thought possible. How long do we have? Jacob asked. Helen appeared at his elbow, her uniform hastily thrown on. Intelligence estimates 2 weeks, she said. Maybe less if they do not stop to consolidate their gains. Within an hour, every crew member was assembled in the briefing hall. The mood was tense. People whispered to each other. their faces showing fear and determination in equal measure. Jacob stood at the front with Nina and addressed them. "You all know why we are here," he said. "The Krell Dominion has begun its invasion of human space. The colonial governments have issued a formal statement. They are abandoning Earth to concentrate their forces on defending the core worlds. As of now, we are on our own." A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone shouted a question about help from the Galactic Council. Jacob shook his head. "The Council is paralyzed by politics," he said. "No one is coming to save us. We save ourselves or we die. It is that simple." Nina took over. She spoke about the choice they faced. They could surrender without a fight and hope the Krell would be merciful. History suggested they would not be, or they could stand and defend their home with everything they had. It might not be enough, but at least they would go down fighting. The vote was unanimous. They would fight. Over the next 2 weeks, the compound became a hive of frantic activity. Jacob pushed the training schedule to its absolute limit. They ran simulations 18 hours a day. Crews practiced emergency procedures until they could execute them in their sleep. Daniel and his engineering teams worked miracles, upgrading weapon systems and reinforcing hull armor with whatever materials they could scavenge. Helen organized defensive positions around Earth's orbit, coordinating with other ragtag militias who had pledged to fight alongside the sovereign sky. Jacob held a final briefing 3 days before the Krell were expected to arrive. He stood in front of a tactical display showing Earth's orbital space. "This is our battlefield," he said. "The Krell will come with superior numbers and firepower. We cannot beat them in a straight fight, so we will not fight straight." He outlined his strategy. The fleet would use guerrilla tactics, hitting the Krell from unexpected angles and retreating before they could respond. They would use Earth's satellite network and debris fields as cover. They would make the enemy bleed for every inch of space. "It is about making them pay," Jacob said. "Every ship they lose, every hour we delay them, every resource they waste on us makes them weaker for the next fight. We may not survive, but we can hurt them badly enough that others will have a chance." Kai raised his hand. "What if we do survive?" he asked. "What happens then?" Jacob looked at him for a long moment. "Then we have proven something important," he said. "We have proven that Earth matters, that the people the galaxy forgot are still here and still dangerous. The major powers will have to take us seriously." Nina added her own thoughts. "Win or lose, we send a message," she said. "Indigenous peoples have been written off and pushed aside for centuries. Not anymore. After today, the galaxy will remember Earth. After today, they will remember us." On the morning of the 13th day, the Krell arrived. Their fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the solar system. 20 massive warships, each one larger than anything in the Sovereign Sky Fleet. They moved in perfect formation toward Earth, broadcasting a message on all frequencies. The voice was mechanical and cold. "This is Warlord Thrackan of the Krell Dominion," it announced. "The planet Earth is now claimed as property of the Dominion. All inhabitants will surrender immediately. Those who comply will be spared. Those who resist will be annihilated. You have 1 hour to respond." The transmission cut off. In the command center, everyone looked at Nina. She walked slowly to the communication console and activated the response channel. Her voice was steady and clear. "This is Chief Nina Blackfeather of the Apache Nation, speaking for the people of Earth," she said. "We reject your claim, and we reject your ultimatum. This world belongs to us. It has belonged to us for thousands of years. If you want it, you will have to take it. And we promise you this. It will cost you everything." The message went out across every channel, broadcast to the entire planet. Billions of people heard it. In cities and villages, on farms, and in wilderness camps, humans stopped what they were doing and listened to this young indigenous woman defy an alien invasion force. Some laughed. Some cried. But most felt something they had not felt in years. Hope. Maybe not hope for survival, but hope that they would not go quietly into the night. In the command center, Jacob placed a hand on Nina's shoulder. "That was perfect," he said quietly. Nina smiled, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I learned from the best," she replied. "The Krell did not respond with words. They responded with action. Their fleet accelerated toward Earth, weapons charging." Jacob gave the order. "All ships to battle stations. Launch on my mark." The canyon erupted with activity. 30 ships powered up their engines. Launch bays opened. One by one, the vessels of the Sovereign Sky lifted off and climbed toward space. Jacob stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching through the viewport as his fleet assembled in orbit. They looked small and fragile against the vast darkness. But they were there. They were ready. And they would fight. The Krell fleet drew closer. They were not expecting resistance. Earth was supposed to be undefended. This would be a quick and easy conquest. Warlord Thraken sat in his command throne watching the tactical display. A subordinate reported strange energy signatures near Earth's moon. Thraken dismissed it, probably just abandoned satellites or debris. But as his fleet entered the moon's shadow, those energy signatures came to life. The sovereign sky struck like a hammer. 30 ships emerged from hiding and unleashed everything they had. Missiles streaked through space. Railgun rounds tore into Krell hulls. Energy beams carved through armor. In the first 30 seconds of combat, 2 Krell destroyers were destroyed outright and a third was crippled. The ambush was perfect. Before the Krell could respond, the sovereign sky scattered. Ships dove in different directions, disappearing into the maze of satellites and debris that orbited Earth. Thraken roared in fury. He ordered his ships to pursue, but the terrain worked against them. The Krell vessels were large and powerful, but not maneuverable. They struggled to navigate through the cluttered space while the smaller human ships darted around them like angry hornets. Every few minutes, another sovereign sky vessel would appear, strike at a vulnerable target, and vanish before the Krell could bring their superior firepower to bear. It was infuriating and humiliating. Jacob coordinated the attack from the flagship, calling out targets and vectors. His decades of experience showed in every decision. He knew exactly where to hit and when to retreat. Beside him, Nina watched in awe. This was what a master tactician looked like in action. The battle raged for hours. The sovereign sky lost 3 ships destroyed by lucky shots or tactical mistakes. But the Krell lost 5 and had several others badly damaged. Thraken finally pulled his fleet back to regroup. He was shocked and angry. This was supposed to be a minor operation. Instead, he had walked into a trap and taken significant casualties. His subordinates reported that the defending fleet seemed to be using guerrilla tactics. They would not engage in direct combat. Thraken snarled. "Very well," he said. "If they want to hide, we will dig them out." He divided his fleet into smaller squadrons and began a systematic sweep of Earth's orbital space. He also deployed sensor drones to track the human ships. The ambushes would end. The next phase of the battle would be different. On the flagship, Jacob studied the Krell movements. "They are adapting faster than I hoped," he told Nina. "We hurt them, but now they are taking us seriously." "What do we do?" Nina asked. Jacob pulled up a tactical map showing Earth itself. "We take the fight to the atmosphere," he said. "Their big ships will struggle in the gravity well. It is our best chance. But it is also risky. If we fail, they can bombard the surface directly." Nina looked at the map, then at Jacob. "We take the risk," she said. "We did not come this far to play it safe." Jacob nodded and started issuing orders. The sovereign sky would lead the Krell into a trap unlike anything they had seen. But first they needed bait, and Jacob knew exactly what ship would serve that purpose.